The Climate Dictionary. Climate change adaptation refers to actions that help reduce vulnerability to the current or expected impacts of climate change like weather extremes and natural disasters, sea level rise, biodiversity loss, or food and water insecurity. Many adaptation measures need to happen at the local level, so rural communities and cities have a big role to play. Such measures include planting crop varieties that are more resistant to drought and practicing regenerative agriculture, improving water storage and use, managing land to reduce wildfire risks, and building stronger defenses against extreme weather like floods and heat waves. However, adaptation also needs to be driven at the national and international levels. In addition to developing the policies needed to guide adaptation, governments need to look at large-scale measures such as strengthening or relocating infrastructure from coastal areas affected by sea level rise, building infrastructure able to withstand more extreme weather conditions, enhancing early warning systems and access to disaster information, developing insurance mechanisms specific to climate-related threats, and creating new protections for wildlife and natural ecosystems. The world's oceans, their temperature, chemistry, currents, and life drive global systems that make Earth habitable for humankind. Our rainwater, drinking water, weather, climate, coastlines, much of our food, medicines, and even the oxygen in the air we breathe are all provided and regulated by the seas. However, because of climate change, the health of our oceans is now at significant risk. The blue economy concept seeks to promote economic development, social inclusion, and the preservation or improvement of livelihoods while at the same time ensuring environmental sustainability of the oceans and coastal areas. Blue economy has diverse components, including established traditional ocean industries such as fisheries, tourism, and maritime transport, but also new and emerging activities such as offshore renewable energy, aquaculture, seabed extractive activities, and marine biotechnology. Carbon removal is the process of removing greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere through natural solutions such as reforestation and soil management or technological solutions like direct air capture and enhanced mineralization. Carbon removal is not a substitute for cutting greenhouse gas emissions, but it can slow down climate change and is necessary to shorten any period during which we temporarily overshoot our climate targets. Carbon capture and storage is the process of trapping carbon emissions produced by fossil fuel power plants or other industrial processes before they can enter our atmosphere by storing them deep underground. Carbon capture and storage should not be seen as an alternative to the green energy transition, but it has been proposed as a way to tackle emissions from sectors that are difficult to decarbonize, particularly heavy industries like cement, steel, and chemicals. However, these technologies are only in the early development stage and will require carefully designed policies. Dramatically slashing greenhouse gas emissions must remain the top priority to combat the climate crisis. A carbon footprint is a measure of the greenhouse gas emissions released into the atmosphere by a particular person, organization, product, or activity. A bigger carbon footprint means more emissions of carbon dioxide and methane, and therefore a bigger contribution to the climate crisis. Measuring a person's or an organization's carbon footprint entails looking at both the direct emissions resulting from the burning of fossil fuels for energy production, heating, and land and air travel, and indirect emissions resulting from the production and disposal of all food, manufactured goods, and services they consume. Carbon footprints can be reduced by shifting to low-carbon energy sources like wind and solar, improving energy efficiency, strengthening industry policies and regulations, changing purchasing and travel habits, and reducing meat consumption and food waste. Carbon markets are trading schemes that create financial incentives for activities that reduce or remove greenhouse gas emissions. In these schemes, emissions are quantified into carbon credits that can be bought and sold. One tradable carbon credit equals 1 ton of carbon dioxide, or the equivalent amount of a different greenhouse gas reduced, sequestered, or avoided. Carbon credits can be bought by countries as part of their NDC strategy, by corporations with sustainability targets, and by private individuals that want to compensate for their carbon footprint. The supply of carbon credits comes from private entities or governments that develop programs to reduce or remove emissions. These programs are certified by a third party and registered under a carbon market standard. For carbon markets to be successful, countries must work together to secure robust carbon accounting, ensure transparency for carbon market transactions, implement safeguards against human rights abuses and other adverse societal impacts, and combat greenwashing and the misrepresentation of carbon-neutral products and services. A carbon sink is any process, activity, or mechanism that absorbs more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere than it releases. Forests, oceans, and soil are the world's largest natural carbon sinks. Oceans absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through marine ecosystems and the plant and animal life they harbor. Sequestering carbon in marine ecosystems is generally referred to as blue carbon. Forests and soil are the other main natural carbon sinks of the planet, storing carbon in trees and vegetation, wetlands and peat bogs, and plant litter. Today, human activity, like burning fossil fuels and deforestation, causes more carbon to be released into the atmosphere than the Earth's natural carbon sinks can absorb, leading to global warming and climate change. Human activities and climate change are also causing the degradation of these natural carbon sinks, threatening the release of the carbon they store back into the atmosphere. Therefore, protecting carbon sinks and expanding their capability to absorb carbon and store it long-term is a key strategy for tackling climate change and stabilizing the climate. Circular economy refers to models of production and consumption that minimize waste and reduce pollution, promote sustainable uses of natural resources, and help regenerate nature. Circular economy approaches are all around us. They can be employed in a number of different sectors from textiles to buildings and construction, and at various stages of a product's life cycle, including design, manufacturing, distribution, and disposal. Besides helping tackle the problem of pollution, circular economy approaches can play a critical role in solving other complex challenges such as climate change and biodiversity loss. They can help countries accelerate their transition to more resilient and lower carbon economies while also creating new green jobs. Currently, only 7.2% of used materials are cycled back into our economies after use. This has a significant burden on the environment and contributes to the climate, biodiversity, and pollution crisis. As a result, we currently need about 1.7 Earths to deliver on all the world's resource demands. The climate crisis refers to the serious problems that are being caused or are likely to be caused by changes in the planet's climate, including weather extremes and natural disasters, ocean acidification and sea level rise, loss of biodiversity, food and water insecurity, health risks, economic disruption, displacement, and even violent conflict. Since the 1800s, human activities have caused the Earth's average temperature to increase by about 1.2 degrees C, with more than two-thirds of this warming occurring since 1975. This is already causing significant damage to human societies and natural ecosystems in many parts of the world. More than 3 billion people live in places that are very vulnerable to the climate crisis, with lower income countries being disproportionately affected. Scientists expect that an increase beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius would begin to lead to a series of dangerous tipping points that would make many changes irreversible and pose a very serious threat to human civilization. This is why governments must act now to drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions and chart a course for reaching net zero in the coming decades, invest in adaptation to the unavoidable impacts of climate change, and protect and restore natural ecosystems and biomes upon which the planet depends. Climate finance refers to financial resources and instruments that are used to support action on climate change. Climate finance is critical to addressing climate change because of the large-scale investments that are needed to transition to a low-carbon global economy and to help societies build resilience and adapt to the impacts of climate change. Climate finance can come from different sources, public or private, national or international, bilateral or multilateral. It can employ different instruments such as grants and donations, green bonds, debt swaps, guarantees, and concessional loans. And it can be used for different activities, including mitigation, adaptation, and resilience building. Some multilateral funds that countries can access include the Green Climate Fund, GCF, the Global Environment Facility, GEF, and the Adaptation Fund, AF. High-income countries with a significant historical contribution to climate change have committed to raising $100 billion every year to fund climate action in low-income countries. However, this target has not yet been reached and more funding is required for both mitigation and adaptation interventions. Climate justice means putting equity and human rights at the core of decision-making and action on climate change. One aspect of climate justice relates to the unequal historical responsibility that countries bear in relation to the climate crisis. The concept suggests that the countries, industries, and businesses that have become wealthy from activities that emitted the most greenhouse gas emissions have a responsibility to help mitigate the impacts of climate change on those affected, particularly the most vulnerable countries and communities, who often are the ones that have contributed the least to the crisis. Even within the same country, because of structural inequalities based on race, ethnicity, gender, and socioeconomic status, the responsibilities in addressing climate change need to be divided fairly, with the biggest responsibility resting on those who have contributed to and benefited from causing the crisis the most. Another aspect of climate justice is the intergenerational one. Children and young people today have not contributed to the climate crisis in a significant way but will bear the full force of climate change impacts as they advance through life. Because their human rights are threatened by the decisions of previous generations, they must have central role in all climate decision-making and action. Under the Paris Agreement, countries are expected to take the necessary measures to avoid dangerous climate change by limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and pursuing efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But even best-case scenarios now indicate a significant chance of overshooting these goals, even if temporarily. Climate overshoot refers to the period during which warming will have increased past 1.5 degrees C before falling back down. This period will probably occur around the middle of this century, but troubling signs are emerging that it may occur even earlier. The longer the climate overshoot lasts, the more dangerous the world will become. A prolonged period of higher global temperatures will have devastating and irreversible impacts on natural ecosystems, biodiversity, and human communities, particularly in dry areas, coastal zones, and other vulnerable locations. Making deep emission cuts during this decade is of extreme importance to limiting the duration and impacts of the climate overshoot. Climate change can exacerbate food, water, and livelihood insecurity, with cascading effects such as displacement and migration and increased competition over natural resources, all of which can lead to increased tensions and instability in a country or a region. Furthermore, the impacts of climate change can aggravate or prolong existing violent conflicts and make it more difficult to deliver climate action and to reach and sustain peace. Climate security refers to evaluating, managing, and reducing the risks to peace and stability brought on by the climate crisis. This means ensuring that climate mitigation and adaptation goes beyond doing no harm and contributes positively to peace and stability. It also means that conflict prevention and peace-building interventions take climate impacts into account. The technical solutions to climate action and adaptation can serve as opportunities to build peace and mend the social fabric, especially in countries affected by conflict and fragility. Climate action can help alleviate the underlying drivers of conflict and fragility. For example, access to renewable energy can be a lifeline which supports clean water, light, warmth, and sustenance, as well as basic and emergency services. It also powers local economic development while setting countries on a sustainable development pathway to recovery. The annual United Nations conference dedicated to climate change, called the Conference of the Parties or COP, has been organized under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change (UNFCCC) since 1995. At the 21st COP or COP21, which took place in 2015, the Paris Agreement was signed. The conference now brings together all nations who are parties to the Paris Agreement to discuss their next steps to combat climate change and further establish legally binding agreements to support climate action.